One of the most frustrating things about Tolkien's universe are the Nazgul. He created these terrifying villains with an incredibly interesting origin, but didn't give a single one of them a backstory. Only 2 of them are even named, and one of those names is actually just a title. That said, non-canon adaptations of Tolkien's work have not shied away from giving some personality to the Nazgul. Some of these backstories are great, some of them are completely insane. So in this video, let's step outside of canon and talk about the wildest background stories of the Nazgul that could be found in MERP, Middle-earth Roleplaying. To be fair to Tolkien, from an in-universe perspective, it makes sense that we don't know much about the Nazgul. By the time of the War of the Ring, they're nearing 5,000 years old. That alone is a good reason for why we don't know who they were, because records need to survive that long. To make it more difficult, 6 of the Nazgul might have been from places where records were never kept, or places where records would have never reached the Westlands. As for the 3 Númenórean Nazgul, their names might have been struck from the records, or maybe they were lost in the downfall of Númenor. So yeah, there's good reasons as to why we only know the names Khamul and the Witch-king of Angmar, and beyond that, we only know that Khamul was from the east. So for adaptations looking to create their own lore, the Nazgul are a great blank slate. They're sorcerers, warriors, and kings from an age of great turmoil who all ended up enslaved to Sauron. There's the bones of great characters there, and plenty of room for creativity. Some adaptations opted to make up elaborate backstories for them, some were happy to yield a little less, and others did some insane shit. So let's cover the non-canon Nazgul from MERP, also known as Middle-earth Roleplaying. While there are other infamous non-canon backstories for the Nazgul, such as those in Shadow of War, the ones from MERP are the most in-depth, and the most widely used by other adaptations, such as mods like Divide and Conquer for Medieval 2 Total War, and Realms in Exile for Crusader Kings 3. Some of the MERP backstories are pretty good, others are insane, but they're all fairly good at making each of the Nazgul somewhat unique. Let's first talk about our 2 canon Nazgul, the most well-known being the Witch-king of Angmar. According to MERP, the Witch-king of Angmar was born in Númenor in 1820 of the Second Age, as the second son of the future king of Númenor, Tar-Kiryatan. Although his birth name was Tindamul, he earned the name Murazor, the Black Prince, thanks to the colour of his hair. Unfortunately, Murazor grew up in an environment which fostered rebellion and ambition. His father, Tar-Kiryatan, was the first king of Númenor to be touched by the Shadow, and his own brother, the future Taratanamir, would end up worse. So, Murazor, unwilling to live in the shadow of his brother, decided to claim his own glory. In 1880, he set out from Númenor with a small fleet with the idea of founding his own kingdom. His first attempt at Londare was a failure, but at the future side of Umbar he had more success and declared his own kingdom. Unfortunately for Murazor, it took only a few months for Tar-Kiryatan to learn of this rebellion, and he angrily recalled him to Númenor. Murazor was afraid of punishment, so he fled, and a few years later he landed in Barad-dûr. For 115 years he trained under Sauron, becoming a proficient and loyal servant, and Sauron ended up rewarding him in 1998 by giving him a Ring of Power. For the next 2 ages, Murazor would be Sauron's second in command, eventually earning the name the Witch-king of Angmar. So yeah, the MERP origin for the Witch King is that he was a spoiled royal prince who wanted his own house, had a tantrum, and then ran away and joined the bad guys. The second canon Nazgul was Khamul the Easterling, of which we know naught beyond his name. Fortunately, MERP gives Khamul a fairly large backstory, and content warning, I'm about to butcher some pronunciations. In MERP, Khamul was born as Khamul in 1744 of the Second Age, and was heir to the throne of a kingdom called Womarwaz-Druz in the far east of Middle-earth. His mother died young, so Khamul's mother figure ended up being an Avaran elf named Dardarian, who was also the queen of a place called Helkarth. So yeah, she was quite busy between being a queen and helping to raise someone else's son. Thanks to Dardarian, Khamul ended up growing up with a healthy lust for immortality. Not that Khamul was short-lived himself. For some reason, people from his lineage could live to be over 200 years old. From what I've read, it's because the high nobility of Womarwaz-Druz intermixed with the Avari. Not really how it all works, but why not? Khamul ended up becoming king in 1844, and he immediately had a huge problem on his plate: the Númenóreans. Their colonies in the east were gradually eroding the supremacy of Womarwaz-Druz, and despite Khamul's best efforts by 1994, things were looking dire. So Khamul turned to Dondarrion, who seduced him and offered him an alliance. The Wamawas Druze and the Avari formed this alliance, causing the Númenóreans to retreat. However, only 2 years later, Dondarrion offered Khamul a Ring of Power, which he had gotten from some trustworthy guy named Annatar. Khamul accepted it, and a year later, he vanished, leaving his kingdom to dramatically collapse behind him. Unknown to his former subjects, he had went to Mordor, where he would eventually be known as Khamul, and over the years, he would work most prominently in contesting the Blue Wizards. Alright, let's move on to the fun stuff, our totally made up Nazgul. The third of the Nazgul was Dendra Dwa, born in 1949 on the island of Wa? Let's just call it Wa, located off the very far southeastern coast of Middle-earth. Dendra Dwa was sort of like the John Wick of the Nazgul, but the evil version. He started out as a mere fisherman, but in 1965 his village was attacked and conquered by raiders from the mainland kingdom of Hent, and his father was mortally wounded. Dwa vowed revenge, went to the mainland where he trained as a warrior and a sorcerer for the next 15 years. During this time, he developed an affinity for hounds and began training a huge war pack. In 1980, with a small group of warriors and an army of hounds, he returned to Wau, slaughtered the invaders, and avenged his father. Unfortunately, this wasn't really a liberation. Dwa declared himself High Lord of the island, which became known as the Isle of Dogs, and Dwa was often called the Dog Lord. He built a fleet and began terrorizing the mainland coasts and conquering the neighbouring islands, effectively becoming something of a pirate king. In 1998, his armies were poised to invade Hent, but suddenly, Dendra Dwa apparently vanished. Unknown to all outsiders, he had accepted a ring of power from Sauron. Dwa's nephew would then assume the mantle of Dog Lord, but he was not truly in control. Dendra Dwa continued to rule his kingdom from the shadows for the next 252 years, before he was eventually called to Barad-dûr. But Dendra Dwa was not finished with his homeland. He would return in the Third Age between 1050 and 1640, re-establish his old kingdom, and once again rule from the shadows. The fourth of the Nazgul was Indur, born in 1955 in the Second Age in the Republic of Coronande. Yes, a republic in my Middle-earth? How scandalous. Coronande was in the far south of Middle-earth, in the jungle region of Mumakan, beneath the Yellow Mountains and the deserts of Harad. Indur had it made from the beginning. He was born into the wealthiest family in Coronande, and by 25, he was already a powerful merchant and politician. His chief concern was the nearby Númenórean colony of Stonetruck, which was beginning to eat into the profits of Coronande, so with the support of many within the Republic, he seized control and declared himself the first king of Corlan. Unfortunately, democracy did not die with a thunderous applause for him, and for the next 23 years, he faced constant rebellions. Unfortunately for Indur, in the year 2000, changing circumstances in the region, which I'm not going to go into. Basically, it involves some elf called the Magician taking over Stonetruck. Honestly, it's really stupid. Anyway, Indur was overthrown and fled east into the jungles of Mumakan. Fortunately, or maybe unfortunately for Indur, Sauron had been watching him with great interest, and in 2001 he offered him a ring of power. Indur accepted and used his new power to unite the tribes of Mumakan and became its first emperor, adopting the name Giamav II. Giamav I was their god, by the way. Unlike the other Nazgul, Indur did not then leave his kingdom behind. He instead ruled it for the next 1261 years, conquering vast lands, although he was unable to capture both Stonetruck and Coronande. Mumakan, however, could not contest with Númenor, and in 3262 his empire was shattered by Ar-Pharazôn. Indur fled to Mordor, but he was not done with Mumakan. He returned in 1250, and over the next decade maneuvered the tribes into forming a new empire. He would then rule Mumakan again over two different periods, as Giamav III from 1264 to 1640, and as Giamav IV from 2460 to 2941. During these periods, he would regularly assassinate his enemies, earning the name Dawndeath. Thus, he ended up being known as Gi-Indur Dawndeath. That's a pretty cool name, I must say. Oh, and if he isn't cool enough already, he was over 2 meters tall, so he was an absolute unit. The fifth of the Nazgul was a weird dude. He was born as a Corahil in 1888 in Númenor, and was apparently a cousin of Mirazor, the Witch-king. He did not stay in Númenor for long. His family moved to the south of Middle-earth in 1904 to rule over the Númenorian client kingdom of Kiriatanor or Ambulacor. If you've played the Realms in Exile mod for CK3, you would know it as An Balkumagan. 14 years later, at merely 30 years old, Akorahil decided that it was his time to shine. He met a Haradrim priest and exchanged his eyes for 2 magical gems called the Eyes of the Well, because this is just a normal thing to do. He was now blind, but the gems gave him magical powers. So he used his magical powers to cast a spell on his father, which caused him to kill himself, because once again that's just what you do. Then Akorahil celebrated by ascending the throne of Kirjatanor, declared himself the Storm King, formed a host called the Army of the Southern Dragon, married his sister, who was named Akoraphil, and started conquering his neighbours. So yeah, Akorahil hasn't even gotten a Ring of Power yet, and I think it's safe to say that he's already a really bad dude. Akorahil's patricidal, incestual, and genocidal shenanigans didn't go unnoticed. In 2000, an emissary of Sauron offered him a Ring of Power, and of course he accepted. He became reclusive, his sister wife and his children fled, he purged his court of Númenórean loyalists, as well as those who acted too independently. Nevertheless, he remained nominally loyal to Númenor for the next 250 years, until 2250 when Tar and Calimon decided that all of his colonies needed to reaffirm their loyalty. The Storm King decided that this was the moment to turn against Númenor, and he allied with Mordor. Unfortunately for him, it amounted for naught. In 2280, Númenor invaded and Akorahil was forced to flee to Mordor, where he became the overseer of the slave fields of Nirn. He did return to An Balkumagan for a few centuries during the Third Age, but he spent most of his time with the Witch-king in Minas Morgul, and they became Nazgul friends. After all, they were cousins. The sixth of the Nazgul was a man named Hamarath of Dear. He was born in 1954 of the Second Age in the Forest of Dear, in the far north of Middle-earth. He was one of the Urdor, men who had originally worshipped Morgoth, but had reformed to be more peaceful by this point in the Second Age. But Hamarath wasn't peaceful. He learned sorcery from the Avari clan who lived nearby, and he wanted to put that power to use, by conquering more land. His sister, who was the Queen of Erd, was horrified and ordered him to be exiled, but in a short struggle she was killed by some of Hamarath's servants. Whoops. Hamarath then declared himself King of Erd, and with the aid of the Avari he had conquered the entire region by 1992. As you might expect though, Hamarath then turned on the Avari, being jealous of their immortality. This went terribly. He was defeated in 2 great battles and then appealed to Sauron for help. In 2000, Sauron sent Khamul with a Ring of Power, and Hamarath accepted it. He then used his newfound power to defeat the Avari and declared himself Lord of the North, ruling as Sauron's client for the next 250 years. During this time, he assembled a terrifying army called the Sledge Horde, war sleds drawn by polar bears, pretty metal. He was called to Mordor after this, and was responsible for many of Mordor's great fortifications. He returned to Erd in the middle of the Third Age and re-established his kingdom, a common theme with the Nazgul, but he would return to Mordor once again and would become the commander of the fortress of Durthang. The seventh of the Nazgul was very unique indeed, because it was a woman, Adunafel, born to a noble family in Númenor in 1823 of the Second Age. Like the other Númenorian Nazgul, Adunafel didn't get along with her family. Her father died young, and she disliked her mother, who was close with the elves. This resulted in Adunafel being an early supporter of the King's Men faction, and in 1914 she left Númenor to found her own realm in Middle-earth. She set up a fortress on the peninsula northwest of Umbar, and by 1939 she controlled a vast coastal domain between Umbar and the River Harnen. Her desire for independence led to diplomatic disputes with Tar-Kiryatan, but she could not reject Númenorian authority when Sauron was constantly attacking her realm from Mordor. But realizing he could exploit something, Sauron changed his plans, and in 2001 he gave Adunafel a Ring of Power. Like the other Nazgul, she became reclusive, ruling from the shadows. But in 2280, interestingly, the same year that Tar and Calimon crushed her fellow Númenorian Nazgul, Akorahil, she launched an attack on Umbar, which was at this point a Númenorian colony. This attack was a disaster, so she abandoned her fortress and made a new one along the River Harnen, close to Mordor. There, she ruled a piece of Harad for the next 1,000 years. She retreated to Mordor after Sauron was captured by Ar-Pharazôn, but returned to the Harnan in 1050 of the Third Age, just after the region was occupied by Gondor. For the next 6 centuries, she would attempt to incite rebellion amongst the Haradrim against Gondor, and after that, she would return to Mordor and Dol Guldur. She was apparently the Nazgul that was responsible for the attacks on Lothlorien and Mirkwood during the War of the Ring. The 8th Nazgul was Ren, the Unclean, the Insane, the Fire King. You just know this one is going to be great. He was born in 1969 of the Second Age in a land called Chesart, just to the east of Khand. Life was good at first. He was a trained illusionist, whatever that means. He had a wife, 2 sons, and was writing a book about enchanting. And then, in 1998, a plague ripped through Chesart. Ren survived, but the near-death ordeal left him horrifically insane. He started to believe that he was the Fire King, the son of a literal volcano, and like all good insane people, he started a cult. This worked out really well for him, and by 2001, he had subjugated all of Chesart, and was given a Ring of Power by Sauron. Ren used the Ring of Power to do even more insane shit. He purged all non-believers from Chesart, including his own family. His purges were so thorough that Chesart's population dropped by over half. He was basically the Pol Pot of Middle-earth. He would then spend over 1,000 years on his fiery throne, launching 2 expansionist wars against places you've never heard of during this time. Like the other Nazgul, he fled to Mordor after Sauron was captured, and like the other Nazgul, he returned to his homeland during the Third Age, ruling between 1264 to 1640 and 2063 to 2941. Oddly enough, these were apparently prosperous times for Chesart because the Che people were often oppressed by the neighbouring Variags of Khand. Apparently, having an insane cult leader as a king was better than that. Our last Nazgul is way more normal. He was born as Uvarfa Achef in 1970 of the Second Age in Khand. Uvarfa was a bit of a prodigy. At 18 years old, his cavalry charge at a battle called Nospeca restored his family to the throne of Upper Khand. When Uvarfa's father died in 1999, his uncle seized the throne and ordered Uvarfa's execution. The young prince fled to Lower Khand, and the king there, for some reason, gave him command of his army. Uvarfa, of course, used this army to take Lower Khand for himself the following year, and then retook Upper Khand, uniting Khand for the first time in history. Sauron saw this and was like, wow, so he gave Uvarfa a Ring of Power in 2002. Uvarfa then ruled Khand for the next 1260 years, expanding Sauron's influence alongside his neighbouring insane Fire King and fellow Nazgul, Ren the Unclean. He actually didn't flee to Mordor after Sauron's capture, but he was forced to relinquish his kingdom after the War of the Last Alliance. He returned in 1050 of the Third Age, became king again in 1100, and then spent 540 years ruling the kingdom in a terrifying manner. He again returned to Khand in 1854, playing a part in the initial invasion of the Wainriders against Gondor. After that, he spent the rest of the Third Age playing as a messenger between Mordor and Dol Guldur. This is why he was known as Uvarfa the Rider, Uvarfa the Horseman. He rode horses, he was a good messenger, good for him. Okay, so those are the MERP Nazgul. Murazor the Witch-king, a prince throwing a temper tantrum, Khamul the Easterling, who was seduced by his elven stepmom, Dendra Dwa the Dog Lord, evil John Wick, lover of dogs, pirate king, Jinder Dawndeath, a merchant turned emperor and later assassin, a Corahil the blind sorcerer, really just an all-round awful person, Hamarath of Dear, the Ice King, whose whole downfall started because he may have accidentally killed his sister, Adunafel, the only female Nazgul, loved music, hated her mum, Ren the Unclean, an insane cult leader who believed he was the son of a volcano, and finally Uvarfa the Horseman, a young prodigy and later a brutal warlord. So how accurate are these origins? Well, the thing is that Tolkien wrote very little about the Nazgul and about Rhûn and Harad in particular, so technically all of these backstories exist on a sliding scale of plausibility. The Witch-king being a member of the royal family who went rogue is fairly plausible, as are a Corahil and a Adunafel as Númenorian colonial lords who ended up siding with Sauron. As for the rest, well, we only know that Sauron gave the Rings of Power to men who were ambitious and clearly showed him great promise, and I think all of the eastern and southern Nazgul did do that. I mean, you had multiple kings, multiple people who came from nothing to seize their destiny, and multiple people who were trained in magic. That said, there is some stuff that doesn't really make sense. For example, Khamul was already over 200 years old by the time he accepted the Ring of Power, explained because he had Avaran blood, but that's not really how longevity works in Middle-earth. You have some things that feel like they fit more in D&D than they do in Middle-earth, such as a Corahil exchanging his eyes for magical gems that gave him powers, and Ren being a trained illusionist. To be honest, I have over 1,000 hours in Oblivion and Skyrim, and I never really did much with illusion spells. I guess that's why Ren respect into being insane. Perhaps the most egregious lore dispute is making one of the Nazgul a woman, a Dunafel. I believe in the Realms in Exile mod for CK3, they do change this by making a Dunafel a man. I'm all for equality, but the Nazgul are described as men, and to be honest, if you're a woman, why would you want to be a Nazgul anyway? Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. If you have any suggestions for other non-canon content that I should talk about, please let me know. This could be anything from MERP to Lotro to even things like Shadow of Mordor. I've already done a few videos on Lotro, you can check them out on the non-canon playlist. Cheers, farewell, and remember, if you go by MERP lore, the fact that the Witch King did so much in the Third Age might have been him being insecure about objectively being the least cool Nazgul in the Second Age.